At 6:40 in the morning, a landing craft off Omaha Beach dropped its ramp into water that came up to a man's chest. The first 3 soldiers went down before their boots found sand. The fourth kept moving because there was nowhere else to go. Behind him, a radio man tried to raise a company commander who was already dead. A medic crawled through red water with a morphine pouch in his teeth. A tank burned so close to the tide line that the heat rolled across the surf like a furnace door opening. That was the American army the Germans saw on June 6, 1944. Bleeding, improvising, learning under fire. And across the channel, in a polished British mess room where the glasses were clean, and the chairs had not been touched by shrapnel, an old officer made the kind of remark men make when they think history still belongs to them. He called the Americans rich amateurs. Not soldiers yet. Not really. Just well-fed boys with loud engines, too much equipment, and no idea what war actually cost. That sentence should have died in that room. Instead, it traveled. First to a furious American major who almost started a fight, then to a captain who stopped him with one sentence. Do not waste this in a bar. Put it where a general can use it. 72 hours later, the words were sitting on George Patton's desk. No official minute records his face when he read them, but the staff officers in that room knew enough to stop talking. Patton did not shout. He did not throw the paper. He simply read the insult once, folded it, and placed it beneath a map of Normandy. Then he said, very quietly, "Bring me the records." Not opinions, not speeches, not patriotic noise, the records. Miles advanced, bridges taken, units delayed, tanks repaired, fuel delivered, artillery missions fired, casualties sustained, objectives missed. Objectives seized before the timetable said they should even be reachable, because Patton understood something that every old empire forgets at least once. Experience is not how long you have been fighting. Experience is how fast you learn when the fighting changes, and Normandy had changed everything. By late June, the invasion beaches were no longer beaches. They were a grinding machine of hedgerows, flooded lanes, shattered villages, and roads so narrow that one disabled vehicle could stop a battalion. The British Army had history. Nobody could deny that. It had stood in 1940 when Europe was falling. It had fought through desert, retreat, bombardment, and hunger. Its officers carried medals that were not decorative. They had earned them. But some of those same officers had turned endurance into a throne. They believed seniority was the same thing as command truth. They believed that because Britain had suffered longer, Britain understood better. They believed the Americans needed guidance, correction, supervision. And beneath all the polite staff language, the old message remained, you are useful, you are powerful, but you are still the younger brother. Patton had spent his life preparing to reject that sentence. He had chased Villa in Mexico. He had commanded tanks in the First World War. He had read cavalry manuals, Roman campaigns, Napoleon's marches, and every ugly report he could find about machines breaking down in mud. He was vain. He was profane. He was often impossible. He had nearly destroyed his career the year before with an act of cruelty in a hospital that Eisenhower never forgot. But when it came to offensive war, Patton saw a battlefield like a mechanic sees an end. He did not look for dignity. He looked for motion. Where was the pressure? Where was the friction? Where was the part that would fail first if you pushed hard enough? And when his staff brought him the first pile of Normandy records, he saw the same pattern line after line. American units were not polished. They were not elegant. They made mistakes. They got lost. Their radios failed. Their tanks drowned, burned, or buried themselves in Norman mud. But they adapted with terrifying speed. A battalion discovered that hedgerow banks stopped tanks, so a sergeant welded scrap metal teeth to the front of a Sherman and turned the tank into a hedge cutter. A forward observer realized one battery was not enough, so artillery sections began linking fire missions into concentrated strikes that arrived faster than German officers expected. Maintenance crews learned that a damaged tank left for a depot was a tank lost for days, so they dragged repairs forward under canvas, beside roads, with parts stripped from vehicles too wrecked to save. Supply officers stopped treating fuel like paperwork and started treating it like blood. Keep it moving, or the whole body dies. That was the file Patton wanted. The evidence that the Americans were not winning because they had more. They were winning because under pressure, they were changing faster. The meeting was arranged under the softest possible name, Coordination Review. Nothing dramatic, nothing personal. A few British commanders, a few American staff officers, maps on the walls, coffee on the table. The kind of gathering where men use the word cooperation until nobody remembers what the problem is. Patton entered late enough for the room to notice, and early enough for no one to call it rude. He shook hands. He thanked them. He talked about unity, supply corridors, and common purpose. For almost 10 minutes, he was so reasonable that one British brigadier leaned back in his chair and relaxed. That was the mistake. A senior British officer said, "Naturally, General, we are always prepared to lend the benefit of experience." The room barely changed, but Patton's eyes did. He nodded to his aide. The first chart went up. Not a speech, a chart, then another. Then another routes opened since the landing. Average repair time by armored unit. Delay reports by cause. Artillery response windows. Beachhead expansion. German counterattack disruptions. Fuel tonnage moved from shore dump to frontline formation. British officers studied the numbers with the guarded patience of men waiting for the trick. There was no trick. The numbers were not written to flatter America. Some of them made American command look wasteful, chaotic, almost reckless. But taken together, they showed a fact that could not be dismissed with a joke in a mess room. The American army in Normandy had become a learning organism. It found obstacles, invented crude solutions, tested them under fire, and spread the successful ones faster than formal doctrine could catch up. Patton did not say, "We are better than you." That would have been too small, he said. The question is not who has the older army. The question is who changes fastest when the enemy changes the problem. A colonel across the table cleared his throat. "General, with respect, speed is not always soundness." Patton looked at him. "No," he said. "But delay is not always wisdom." That line landed harder than the charts, because everyone in the room knew the difference between caution and ritual. Caution protects men from foolish risk. Ritual protects officers from admitting that yesterday's habits have stopped working. Patton walked to the map and placed 2 fingers on the American sector. "Your men are brave," he said. "No one here disputes it. British infantry has held ground that other armies would have abandoned. Your commandos have forgotten more about night work than some of our units have learned. Your intelligence networks on this continent are worth more than half the speeches made about them." Then his hand moved to the roads behind the beachhead. "But the war we are now in is not the war of 1940. It is not the Desert War. It is not a gentleman's argument about who endured first." His voice tightened. "It is an industrial pursuit through broken country. It will be won by the army that can repair faster, refuel faster, fire faster, decide faster, and move before the enemy's mind catches up." Silence. He pushed the folded insult across the table without saying where it came from. "Rich amateurs. Well-fed boys, not soldiers yet." The British officer nearest the paper read it. His jaw hardened. He passed it down. By the time it reached the far end of the table, the air had gone cold. Patton let them sit with it. Then he said, "That kind of talk is not harmless. It slows cooperation. It makes good officers ignore useful methods because the method comes from the wrong flag. It costs time, and in Normandy, time is not pride. Time is blood." For the first time, no one tried to answer. Patton did not ask for an apology. He asked for something more useful, a staff exchange. American maintenance officers would show British units the forward repair system that was getting damaged vehicles back into the line with impossible speed. British commando instructors would work with American raider and ranger elements on night movement, small unit raids, and coastal approach discipline. American artillery teams would demonstrate faster fire control procedures. British intelligence officers would share local networks and German order of battle detail without burying it under layers of service pride. not a lecture. An exchange, no senior partner, no junior partner. Just hard knowledge moving to the men who could use it. One British general stared at the proposal for a long time. Then he said the most reluctant, honest sentence in the English language. "There may be value in this." Patton smiled, not kindly. "That is all I needed you to notice." The program began small. A repair park near a Norman orchard. A British major watching American mechanics pull a transmission from a damaged Sherman while artillery thumped somewhere beyond the tree line. He expected disorder. What he saw was speed with a system inside it. Parts were marked in chalk. Tools were laid out on tarpaulin. A corporal with grease to his elbows knew exactly which wrecks were donors and which were patients. A lieutenant kept a board where vehicles were tracked by hours, not days. A British sergeant muttered, "Looks like a scrapyard." The American corporal looked up and said, "Yes, Sergeant, a scrapyard that gives tanks back." By evening, two machines that should have been written off were moving toward the road again. At another site, British instructors took American soldiers through dark fields without a shouted order, teaching them how to move like the ground itself was listening. In a farmhouse converted into an artillery post, American fire direction men showed British observers how multiple batteries could be pulled onto a target before the enemy had time to relocate. Not every lesson traveled well. Some officers resisted. Some took notes with the expression of men swallowing medicine. Some American commanders hated being told the British did anything better. Some British commanders hated discovering the Americans did anything better. But the useful parts stuck. Because war has one mercy, it is cruel to vanity. A bad method does not become good because an old regiment loves it. A good method does not become childish because a young army invented it. Then came the test no briefing room could stage, Operation Cobra. By late July, the Normandy front had become a pressure cooker. The Allies had men, guns, aircraft, fuel, and material power beyond anything Germany could replace. But the Germans still held enough ground, enough hedges, enough villages, and enough discipline to make every mile expensive. On July 25th, the American breakout began under a sky crowded with bombers. The bombing was devastating and imperfect. Some bombs fell short. American men died under American aircraft. There was no clean version of the moment. But when the gap opened, the question became brutally simple. Could the Americans exploit faster than the Germans could recover? This was the argument Patton had been making all along. Not in theory, in motion. The first American formations pushed into the breach. Behind them came fuel trucks, maintenance teams, ambulances, field kitchens, engineers, signal crews, and artillery, moving as if the rear area had been kicked forward with the front. The German line did not collapse all at once. It came apart in pieces, a roadblock bypassed before orders reached it. A village surrounded before its defenders understood the main column had not stopped. A bridge seized because a junior officer saw the chance and refused to wait for permission that would arrive too late. At Avranches, the door opened, and once it opened, Patton's Third Army turned movement into a weapon. Not speed as glamour, speed as suffocation. German commanders were trained to respond to attacks by identifying the main effort, shifting reserves, and sealing the break against a slower army that could work. Against an army moving faster than reports could become decisions, the system began to fail. By the time a German headquarters knew where the Americans had been, the Americans were already somewhere worse. A column that should have paused for fuel kept going because the fuel had been pushed forward. A tank that should have been abandoned came back because the repair crews were too close to the fight to waste it. A fire mission that should have taken long minutes arrived in a handful of controlled breaths. And every time the Germans reached for the handle of the door had moved. The British officers who had once smiled at American noise began watching American motion differently, not romantically, not with sudden affection. Alliances do not transform like that, but the joke softened. The club, room certainty thinned. More British officers asked to see the repair boards. More American officers admitted that British rating methods had a discipline they needed. Staff rooms became less theatrical and more useful. That was the real victory of Patton's argument. He did not make allies like each other. He made them harder to lie to. And for an army, that matters more, because the enemy does not care which nation has the better manners. The enemy cares which army can put fire, fuel, steel, intelligence, and men at the decisive point before the other side can breathe. In August 1944, the Germans learned that lesson from the wrong end of the road. The Breakout rolled into pursuit. Brittany opened. The German position in western France buckled. The war was not over, but the argument about American amateurism was, no one needed to announce that it had ended. It ended the way many false beliefs end, quietly. First the joke is repeated less often, then only by men who were not there, then only by men who cannot read the map. Patton, of course, did not become easier because he was right. Being right made him more dangerous. He would keep moving, keep offending, keep turning opportunity into demand. He would win battles and lose patience. He would become both legend and problem, sometimes in the same afternoon. By 1945, his name was everywhere. Newspapers loved him. Soldiers argued about him. Superiors managed him like an unstable explosive that happened to point in the enemy's direction. But war ended, and the thing Patton was built to do ended with it. Germany surrendered in May. The armies that had been racing across Europe became occupation forces. Governors, administrators, policemen, historians, and diplomats in uniform. Patton was given Bavaria to govern. It was the wrong job for a man whose genius was pursuit. Occupation required patience with gray areas. Patton preferred black lines on maps and arrows that went forward. His public remarks grew politically poisonous. Eisenhower, who had saved him before, finally had to remove him from command of the Third Army. The man who had turned motion into doctrine was placed over a paper army writing the history of a war he still wanted to fight. He told his wife it felt like being put out to pasture. Then, in December 1945, near Mannheim, a staff car met a turning truck at low speed. No explosion. No heroic battlefield. No enemy gun. Just a bad angle on a German road after the war was already won. Patton broke his neck. He spent his final days paralyzed in a hospital bed in Heidelberg, and died on December 21, 1945. He was 60 years old. At his request, he was buried in Luxembourg with the men of the army he had driven across Europe. That is usually where the story becomes marble. The famous general, the ivory, handled pistols, the speeches, the flags, the easy conclusion that great men shape history because they are louder than everyone else. But the sharper lesson is smaller. It begins not with Patton, but with the captain who stopped a fight in that British mess room. The captain who understood that an insult answered with fists becomes a disciplinary note. An insult answered with evidence becomes a turning point. He did not need to be famous to change the path of the argument. He only needed to put the truth in the room where it could do work. That is what institutions almost always resist. Not courage. They praise courage, not sacrifice. They decorate sacrifice. What they resist is accurate reality when it threatens an old hierarchy. Every army builds a myth about itself. So does every company, every government, every profession, every family that has been successful long enough to confuse memory with proof. The British myth in 1944 was not stupid. It had been earned in fire. But even an earned myth becomes dangerous when it starts refusing new evidence. The American myth would one day have its own dangers. Power always does. That is why the real lesson is not that one flag was superior to another. The lesson is that no flag, no rank, no tradition, and no beautiful story about the past can be allowed to overrule what the battlefield is proving now. In Normandy, the proof was movement. Repair faster. Learn faster. Coordinate faster. Admit faster. Because the army that learns late pays in graves, and the alliance that tells itself comforting lies gives the enemy time. So when Patton walked into that room with maps, charts, and a temper sharpened into discipline, he was not simply defending American pride. He was doing something harder. He was forcing grown men to measure themselves against reality. That is why the argument mattered. Not because it embarrassed anyone, not because it made a better legend, but because somewhere between the surf at Omaha, the maps in Normandy, and the open road beyond Avranches, an alliance stopped pretending the past could command the future. And once it stopped pretending, it could finally move.